Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Eliza. I'm the Customer Engagement Specialist here at Pandal, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this Leadership Series webinar called Navigating Net Zero for the Energy Sector. We are delighted to have Bill Whitelaw as our speaker. Bill is the Managing Director, Strategy and Business Development for Geologic Systems and JWN Energy. He serves with a variety of industry organizations, including the Canadian Society for Unconventional Resources and the Energy Futures Lab. We are delighted to have him present for us today. So without further ado, I'll introduce Bill Whitelaw and hand the stage over to you, Bill.
Thank you very much, Eliza, and welcome to everybody who's taking time out of what undoubtedly is a beautiful summer day here in Calgary. We have the Stampede going on, and it's hard to compete with the Stampede even at a reduced level. So I promise to be brief, and I hope succinct, and I hope I leave you with some insights that perhaps that you have had thought yourself before, but taken together that they're come together in sort of a body of knowledge. And so, you know, the framework here is navigating net zero. I mean, it's a terminology that has crept into our lexicon, and we use it in daily discussions in the energy space. And it really is, I think, probably symbolically the most important three words in navigating the realities of energy systems change that we're in front of right now. And so what in front of you today is a service provider's perspective on how to watch the sector and how to continue to thrive and succeed as the sector goes through some of the most important contortions it will go through in the next 10 years on the pathway to 2030 and beyond that to 2050. So the agenda today is quickly this. It is that service provider's perspective. And we have a wonderful blend in our audience today of service providers and operating companies. And so both sides will resonate with my message somewhat differently, but perhaps there are some good takeaways, because I think that the successful pathway to net zero in many respects is true partnership between service providers and operating companies. And I'll come to more of that in a second. So the net zero context, at least in our company, is just simply a mechanism. It's way to understand what's going on in the leadership conversations that our customers are having. What is top of mind for them in terms of as they figure out a very complex and in many cases bewildering future, and really how we as service providers can really sort of step up to the plate and be part of their solution making. And the other thing about the net zero context, it's really, if you understand the forces that are changing our energy landscape, then you can capitalize them on them as businesses in terms of understanding how the whole system itself is contorting and convulsing, but ideally in a way that progresses us forward. I'll speak to two pieces of our own research that really help you understand as service providers a couple of the key drivers and how you can participate in that in terms of what's happening to free cash flow, and especially in the digital transformation space. I know that's a big empty terminology sometimes when we talk about digital transformation, but there is some very fascinating things going on in terms of the digital world and the data world combined. And then I'll close with some thoughts on the World Petroleum Congress that's happening in Houston in December and in 2023 in Calgary, just also as ways of thinking through is how do you have your own conversations in your own company with your sales teams, with your own management teams around watching where the drill bit is going to be in terms of both the near term and the longer term futures. So just a little bit about us for context. Geologic Systems and JW Energy, we're a full spectrum energy solutions and insights company. As you can see from the slide, we operate in five countries with about 170 staff. We're based in Calgary, and we are a dominant force in the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin in terms of our subsurface solutions like GeoScout. And we recently acquired a company in Houston, SSIO, which allows us to introduce our whole cloud product offering. And we have media channels like the Daily Oil Bulletin, plus our global group, Evaluate Energy, through which we cover about 700 companies across the world in a nauseating level of detail in terms of their operating and finance insights. You know, all companies say this about themselves, but I'm very proud. We do have a deep and diverse talent bench. And again, one of our key advantages when we go up against our competitors is we do have two media channels that allow us to distribute our own content and then also to engage with a much broader industry audience than perhaps some of the other energy intelligence companies. And that's the shameless self-promotion. Every day we come to work in the energy sector and we're barraged by the headlines in our own press, in the industry press, in the mainstream press, and even in the alternative press. And these are just, I won't read them, but you'll see them, they're showing up. And the question is, how do we make sense of them as service providers? How do we think through what the decarbonization movement means to us and our customers as a business? How do we think through in a Canadian context when our Liberal government says that carbon will ultimately bear a price of $170 a metric ton? What does that mean to the way we think about our business and the way we change our business and adapt as the entire energy ecosystem adapts around us? You will see massive amounts of money pouring into the clean tech space. We have wonderful organizations in Canada like Foresight, which is a great clean tech shop that does a wonderful amount of work helping energy companies define their clean technology strategies. At the other end of it, we're also as an industry in both the US and in Canada burdened by our asset retirement obligations. And in Alberta here, for example, the Alberta Energy Regulator is very close to announcing a prescribed annual spend by operating companies on asset retirement, getting at those wells that have been sitting in limbo for many years. Well, what does that mean to our business as cash is directed there? Real opportunities in the Indigenous partnerships and reconciliation space. In Canada, at least there's phenomenal things happening in terms of companies partnering within First Nations communities and other Indigenous communities. That should be an important part of any service provider's strategy. But we're also, as the energy system transitions, we're also barraged by contradictory reports and perspectives. And so the International Energy Agency recently released a report about net zero, or the pathways to net zero 2050, that seemed to contradict other reports that it put out in terms of rising demand for hydrocarbon products. And so how do you make sense of that as a service provider, specifically in the definition of your own business? A day doesn't go by where we're barraged by ESG and sustainability issues, and the pandemic did one thing. It allowed the ESG narrative to come into the vacuum of everybody working from home. This is an important consideration. As a service provider, do you have an ESG framework that aligns in some fashion with your customers' frameworks? And there's a ton going on in the innovation and ecosystem space where new shops are popping up all the time, and how do you watch those from a potential acquisition perspective or a potential competitive threat to you? And then lastly, you'll see in the headlines, and again, this is very much a Canadian thing right at the moment, but a lot is the same thing going on in the US, is new names are becoming more relevant in terms of the way the industry has conversations with itself and with all of its member companies and other stakeholders. So CRIN, the Clean Resource Innovation Network, the Energy Futures Lab, and the Oil Sands Pathway Initiative, which was the initiative by 5 operating companies in Canada's oil sands industry to collaboratively define a pathway to net zero. And so in all of this, it's complex, it's bewildering, it's confusing, it's puzzling, but it's rife with opportunities for the right service provider if they're able to pivot their businesses effectively within that. So in terms of where we sit right now, most of you will realize this just because you go to work in it every day. In the North American context, we're enjoying price recovery and a newfound stability, but it's a different landscape. And people ask me all the time, well, when we recover, what's it going to be like? And I said, it won't be like any other recovery. It'll be more a period of stability. And as the industry goes through its own reflections on how it's going to evolve. So gone are the halcyon days of the ebbs and flows and everybody getting crazy around how they're spending and that sort of thing. And one clear indication of that is what the pressures are on companies' free cash flow. And I'll speak to that in just a moment. But we also see our industry is getting stronger, yet as it gets stronger, it gets smaller. And so you're going to continue to see M&A as a dominant theme as companies continue to consolidate both on the operating side and the E&P side. And a lot of this is driven by a push for optimal efficiency. And in many regards, I would say it's a ruthless optimal efficiency because these companies are getting bigger and they're getting stronger, but they're looking for new ways of doing the way they do their business, and they're expecting their service providers to step into that. So in Canada, you watch Tourmaline, Mike Rose's company, on the acquisition path, done some phenomenal deals to become the largest gas producer in Canada. Cenovus's recent takeover of Husky makes a stronger, more vital company, but it also redefines a lot of us in the service provider space. Is the fellow that we talked to for 5 years or 10 years is gone, and there's a relationship reset as service providers that we have to sort of figure out new ways of figuring out who do we talk to in these companies now as a way of getting our business done. So we're also seeing virtually every day a flurry of net zero announcements, as especially the large international companies are making hay of that as their way of talking to their investment community. And all over the world, and we see this in our Evaluate Energy practice, companies are making investments in different forms of energy. And politically, the Biden and Trudeau administrations, they create both certainty and uncertainty for investors and that sort of thing. But we remember the glorious days. A lot of this started with Larry Fink's letter, and in which he laid out BlackRock's future. And that should be really an important signal to us in the service provider space, is the times they are changing, and lots of money to be made and lots of hay to be made as long as we change with them. And of course, COP26 in Glasgow is only mere months away. I think all service providers should have a very keen interest in the conversations that go on at COP in order to figure out, because you'll get many clues out of that in terms of where your business is going to be in the next 1 to 5, even that beyond that 10 years. So that's the North American context. Again, you all recognize it from a different perspective because you come to work in it every day. But it's when you step back and you realize the range of forces and the complexity of those forces, it really requires service providers to put their thinking caps on and do a lot of soul searching and redefine their businesses as our operating customers are redefining theirs. And we see this through a lot of our technology and our software. We're getting different types of questions all the time. Is, can you do this? Can you change Geoscope to do that? And it's really a signal that these operating companies are thinking about efficiency, and efficiency as they're still trying to stabilize their balance sheets and grow their businesses. So one of the key ways, and many of you as service providers will do this already, is monitoring how companies are spending their cash. And what we saw starting last fall in the analysis that we did was companies were starting to enjoy a bit of strength and starting to generate a lot of free cash flow. And so we do quarterly assessments, and from our Q1 assessment, we looked at 86 North American companies. As commodity prices stabilized and people said, well, we sense that the stability, the recovery is here. We can start being more strategic about how we think about what we're going to do with the cash that we're going to generate as commodity prices seem stable and as we go forward. And so what was interesting for us is figuring out among these 86 companies is there was $9.3 billion of free cash generated compared to only in the same quarter in 2020, 700 million. But the key is, well, these companies are right, they have a lot of cash on hand, but they're being very, very strategic about how they spend it. And so what we look at and we try to analyze is, where is that money going? Is it going to CapEx? Is it debt dynamics that they're looking at? Are they doing share buybacks? Are they spending on acquisitions, or are they finally rewarding shareholders for patience? And it was interesting, the US Oil Group, among that 86 companies, they generated the highest free cash flow. And there's much we normally see in more normal times, a better balance between operating cash flow and CapEx, but we saw this really significant growth in the free cash flow generations. Our oil sands producers in Alberta did very well as well. And when times are good, they tend to be, because of the discipline that they operate with, they tend to generate good free cash. And it's important to watch this and where it's going, because you can monitor the pathways that the cash is flowing to and figure out where you're going to play in that, especially on the CapEx side. Gas producers, both in the US and Canada, did quite well with the free cash flow this quarter, and we expect to see that continuing in Q2. But more importantly, what we're watching is where it's going, right? And so companies are paying down debt. paying down debt. So this quarter, we saw 39% of that $9.3 billion went to debt repayments compared to just 6% in Q1 2020. So that's an important consideration for service providers. The more a company gets a handle on its debt, the more likely it's going to be growing and utilizing your services to watch it. So here's just a historical graph that shows back from Q1 2018, the relationship between free cash flow and how it was spent from cash from operations and CapEx and property acquisitions. And so you can see that relationship. For anybody who wants the deeper report, I'll have my email address at the end, and I'm more than happy to send you the analysis, and you can take it up with your management teams and start to have conversations around the importance of monitoring this in terms of your own balance sheets and your own revenues. And so just again, here is another lens to look at it through. Again, those 5 things that we look at: CapEx and acquisitions, net share repurchases, debt repayments, and dividend repayments. So if you can see the change in the relationship between the purple bars on debt repayment, you can see in Q1 2021 that 39% dominated what the companies were doing in addition to the CapEx and the acquisitions. And so monitoring these relationships on a quarterly basis gives you real clue as a service provider to figure out how your companies, and inside the data set that you would get when you looked at this, you'll see specifically the companies that you're working for and that we track and monitor on them. And many of those names would be familiar to you. So watching cash flow and free cash flow and watching CapEx is really, really important in figuring out where you're going to position your business as a service provider in terms of it. And so when we take this analysis and we measure it and we watch very closely the way operating companies are changing their relationships to their own data sets and how they're deploying data as part of the digital transformation strategy. We did a piece of fairly significant research earlier this year in terms of what we could see as sort of demonstrable changes in how companies are thinking through about the importance of data. It's a bit crazy to say, data is the new oil in that sense, but for many companies it truly is, because they realize that the better and more efficient use of the right data from the right sources really helps reach that optimal efficiency dynamic. And so we've always been a data-driven industry, so there's both new news and old news in this study, and again, more than happy to send it to you. But the key is to watch the trends over time. And that is the idea of saying, oh, well, this operating company is actually deploying this kind of data in this kind of way, they're using this kind of analysis, and they're being better in the subsurface. Those are the companies that we would like to work for, and let's get inside that digital transformation. So in that recent study, and this 45% of the respondents, and these are both service providers and operators, rank operational efficiency as the most important. And that's up 10 points from 2 years ago when we last did this study. So that's up 10 whole points, as you can sort of see that they're thinking about data in a different way and realizing that for all the data that we sit on, we're still not as efficient as we could be with this. And this, for service providers that are in that technology space, this represents real opportunity to help operating companies get a handle on how they're deploying the data and how they're using it to make the right decisions. For a lot of service companies, the data is the driver of their business development strategies. Figuring out where that drill bit is going to be and who's going to be turning it is critically important. We found also competitive analysis. Companies are paying a lot more attention than they were 2 years ago to what their competitors are doing. And this speaks to the dynamic around how they're thinking around their relationship with their investor community and other stakeholder communities. But they're also using competitive analysis in a very important way, and that's about the ESG dynamic, and I'll talk about that. Companies are using data-driven ESG strategies as a way of trying to separate themselves from the rest of the pack in terms of environmental, social, and governance performance. And then lastly, and this one didn't change much, but 25 points go to ranking project planning and R&D as the main driver of data research. And you can kind of see here just by sector, the E&P sector, the oilfield services, and then we break oilfield services down into the development side and the production focus, and you can kind of see where the data is taking you in terms of how they're using it. But more, again, this among many other graphs will be in the document that you'll also receive. But this is the really important sort of inflection point. In the last few years, we're seeing more and more E&Ps incorporating third-party data and commingling it with their own data set into workflows, right? And so that's a fascinating change where it's not dumping stuff into Access or an Excel worksheet. They're looking at technologies and tools that will allow them to marry third-party data, whether it's from regulatory data, third-party providers like ourselves and other great providers, and they're commingling it, as I said, with their own data into new workflows that are achieving those efficiencies and what's important there is we also track, and we figure as close as we can figure, is most operating companies are operating between 75 and 80% of their former workforce size, right? And so the need for new tools and new technologies from a workflow perspective is incredibly important, so you don't burn out the people who remain, right? So, but it's not a perfect world. A lot of the, we in the report, we looked at sort of the lightness to the heaviness of data usage, and what we found was the heavy data users, who on whose backs a lot of this falls from a burden perspective, they're finding real challenges of finding the right technology and the right processes and the right providers to say, we can create one single source of truth and workflow for you in terms of getting all the right data into the right places for the right decision making. And so real opportunity there in the tech space for a lot of service providers. And 1 in 6 continue to say that the data and tools are mostly in silos and really hard to access and get dancing together. So lots of progress being made, but lots of progress still to be made. And again, for those of you on the call who are in that technology provision, cloud-based space, lots of opportunity to get inside and help make these companies more efficient. As we sort of move to the end, coming back to the net zero context, if you're a service provider, here are some of the realities of that face. And in that reality, I mean it to sound not so harsh, but how to figure out how to make your opportunities within the realities of an energy systems transition context. We do a lot of research and around our purse string is going to loosen to a degree, even though capital spending may be increasing. But service providers, and most of you on the call will know this, that pricing pressures will continue, right? They may loosen a bit, but the pricing pressures that we've experienced the last few years, if you take them as a given and figure out how to operate within that context, you're more likely to win the work than others who go expecting a lot more cash simply because companies have a lot more cash on hand. That doesn't mean you can't ask for more, but it means you have to be very, very diligent in how you do the ask. And that's a bit challenging and a bit confusing because, of course, the operating companies are also continuing to shift onto service providers this responsibility for research and innovation in terms of, and that's always been part of our industry and it goes in cycles. And the service sector really is, in many cases, the brains behind a lot of the great efficiencies that companies come up with. And so you have this contradictory dynamic of saying, don't ask us for more, but we want more from you. Service providers have to learn to navigate within that reality. And again, one of the things that we find with our oilfield services clients is we push them in different directions to monitor these new voices and the way legacy voices are shifting. And I'll give you 2 examples of if you, in a Canadian context, there's a great organization called the Energy Futures Lab. And the Energy Futures Lab is really based on the mandate of figuring out what they call future fit hydrocarbons, and some phenomenal work going on among the 75 fellows that form the backbone of the lab, working with the staff. But if you look at the work that they're doing in the lithium space, in the hydrogen space, in the geothermal space, you can uncover all kinds of great nuggets for future business opportunities. And so organizations like the Energy Futures Lab, like the Clean Resource Innovation Network, these are all they're very, very important for service providers to watch, even engage with, because they're really going ahead of the curve and figuring out where the next big opportunities are going to be. But also at the same time, we're seeing the shift in the legacy voices as the industry organizations adapt to the new realities. And those of you in the Canadian context will remember the recent great announcement by the Canadian Association of Oil Well Drilling Contractors, now converting to the Canadian Energy Suppliers Association. That's a deliberate strategy undertaken by the board on behalf of the members to remain in sync with the way the industry changes are unfolding out, particularly in that net zero context. I think that service companies that are figuring out their own energy transition strategies are the ones that are also winning business, and you can see on the global service providers like the Schlumbergers and the Halliburtons, the Bakers of the world, doing some phenomenal stuff in what you would call energy transitions technology. And so to the degree as a smaller service provider, you watch what they're doing and what they're investing in and how they're engaging with the sector on this. Every company of any size can have its own energy transition strategy. It's really what are your inputs into that strategic discussion that you're going to have. And again, the net zero framework is a useful framework for you and your leadership teams and your staff members to sort of figure out how do we play in this net zero space. Again, the other thing I would pin to that is having your own digital transition plan. Most of you already have this, and again, the key is how often do you update it and how often do you keep it sharpened so that you're matching your digital and data-driven thinking with what our operating customers are doing. And that's not an easy task. It requires a lot of investment from your sales folks and from your BD folks and from even your leadership team to engage with the C-suite of, we're finding that the C-suite of operating companies are open to conversations like they've never been before, simply because they realize the importance of the service provider in achieving their ultimate corporate goals. And again, this leads me to be able to say, you should really think through how you would develop your own ESG framework, and one that aligns very nicely with how your customers are thinking about their own ESG strategies. So if you don't have somebody on your staff who's downloading every sustainability report or every news announcement that your customers are making, then that's something you should really contemplate doing right away to say, okay, this is what Cenovus is saying about its emissions strategy. And that's different from what Suncor is saying, to use two Canadian examples, about its emission strategy. How do you figure out how that's going to impact on your business and how your own ESG thinking can adapt to that? I'll give you an example of a great Canadian service company, CDN Controls, out of Grand Prairie in Calgary, had just released its own ESG sustainability report a couple of months back. Phenomenal piece of work in terms of declaring what they are all about as a customer. And you better believe that that kind of report and the publicity that's generated around that gets the attention of the people who are buying their services as well, right? So at a certain point, you're going to be asked, as part of this bid process, send us along what you have as a sustainability, and that's already happening in many cases. And when we audit our oilfield services clients, they say, yep, a conversation doesn't go by without at least it being mentioned. So no harm in developing your own strategy. It's an iterative process. The first report does not have to be perfect. It should show intent and to understand these things, and it should lay the foundation for the way you think about these things, because it'll become almost, I guarantee it, within a year or two, pretty much a requirement to do business. So there, again, as a service provider, there's lots of regulatory and policy shifts, and they're really focusing on what I call all, or the air, water, land dynamic. And as I mentioned earlier, the Alberta Energy Regulator its new liability spending framework will compel companies to spend somewhere between 4 and 5% of their annual revenues on their asset retirement obligations. And so if you're in that abandonment space and decommissioning space, this is phenomenally good news in terms of being able to position yourself to get that business as these companies in an Alberta context. And I have no doubt other regulators will follow suit in that space. So again, the point as a service provider, having somebody on your staff who's monitoring these things and then pulling that information back into the organization. And a ton of this stuff is driven by that net zero framework. And again, I mentioned earlier, COP26 is on the horizon. If you haven't started this kind of thinking as a service provider, this may be a good enough place to start having monitoring the news coverage and the dialogue and the opinions and all the op-ed pieces that will come out. COP runs from October 31st to November 12th. Have somebody on your staff just simply gather as much information that's COP related, pre-COP, during COP, and post-COP, and then ask yourselves the question in your business: how does all this stuff affect our business in the near term, and in 5 years from now, and in 2030 from now? And ask those questions, and I guarantee you, inside of all that will be all kinds of ways and means of thinking about how you might reposition, pivot, make acquisitions, or change your business models to adapt to these new realities. And again, this can all be incorporated into your own net zero strategy. And Geologic and JWN, we're in the sort of halfway through that process of saying, if we want to continue to do the business that we do, we've got to move in lockstep with our customers. And to the degree that our net zero strategy has to pair with their net zero strategy and still drive our business forward, we're finding it a very useful framework to talk at all levels within our organization on how to think through. And net zero is a great framework, because when your staff members go home, they're also barraged by net zero conversations on the evening news and the newspapers that they read and what their neighbors are talking about. All pathways lead to this net zero / climate conversation. The only other thing that I would say is following close behind it, and I don't know what the name of it will be, is watch water carefully. Watch water carefully. And if you're remotely related as a service provider to the water business, once the emissions nut is cracked, the water conversation will closely follow it from a sustainability. And this comes back to the air, water, land perspective. So it's not just all about emissions and net zero, it's all about total stewardship of the way we do business. So these are, again, these are probably things that are happening in your organization, but again, if you're looking for an organizational framework to be able to sort of put them into a box that all staff at all levels, that your shareholders, your own stakeholders can also understand, say, oh, okay, the net zero framework is a very, very useful organizing taxonomy to figure out how we're going to drive our business forward. So lastly, again, on what you watch and how you watch it and how you report back into the organization, you're all familiar with the World Petroleum Council, great organization. Every 3 years organizes a massive gathering, the World Petroleum Congress, and we're sort of honored in the North American context to be hosting back-to-back congresses in Houston in December of this year and in Calgary in 2023. These are important because if you have a way of monitoring the conversations and the way of taking the temperature of the nuances of what people are saying, and even if you can get people to these things, they're great inputs back to your own net zero plan. So in Houston, the theme is innovative energy solutions. You can see the numbers there. It's a big gathering, and the organizers in Houston have done a phenomenal job working in a pandemic context. They're going to bring off a very, very good show. And again, unbelievable business development and competitive intelligence insights can be garnered from just watching. Better to be there, but if you just watch it from a distance, lots of great media coverage on it. And this one will have a blend of both online events and in-person events. But if you're a Canadian stakeholder, the key is Canada will have a massive pavilion in Houston, and they'll really be promoting what's going to happen in 2023 when the World Petroleum Council Canadian arm, we're going to, as I said, have a major presence in Houston. But what's really important is the World Petroleum Congress and the theme that you can see there, energy transitions, the path to net zero. And so I have no insider knowledge of this, but I can imagine that would have been a very, very good sales presentation to the World Petroleum Congress to get that as the legitimate theme. And I suspect the World WPC Canada folks put on a very compelling bid, and they won with that theme on that. So again, an important indicator of where the world is going, and as service providers, the roles that we play in that. And so there will be, between Houston 2021 and Calgary 2023, lots of WPC narratives and dialogues. And again, very important that you sort of figure out a way of building those into your business as you define your own net zero framework and strategy. So with that, happy to take questions and go from there.
Great. Thank you, Bill. We do have one question from the audience. Suncor CEO Mark Little has said that to reach net zero by 2050 would cost about $60 billion, and a large portion of the money would have to come from the government, as it has been done in Norway. What are your thoughts on this?
It's an excellent question. And you'll notice in that interview where Mark Little made that point, it was a co-interview with Alex Pourbaix, who's the CEO of Cenovus. So what you're seeing in the oil sands space is, again, how shall I say it, a new generation of collaboration between the operators. And they've always been very good at collaborating, but they've got it to a strategic level. As I said, one of the important things to watch, if you go to Oil Sands Pathways, the new website of the 5 operating companies that have joined, including Cenovus, and Suncor, you'll see that they've laid out a very clear path to what a 2050 scenario might look like. And these interviews with Mark Little and Alex and Derek Evans and the other players that are involved in that are really all about filling in the space behind that declaration. And by that, what I mean is that they need government on board, right? And they need government on board through organizations, to use a couple of Alberta examples, Alberta Innovates, Emissions Reduction Alberta, and all of those agencies that the government has set up to be part of that process. Because Mark Little is absolutely right. You got to remember, in a Canadian context, that we all own, as Canadians, we all own those mineral rights in the interest of the Crown, right? And this is, I think, the subtext of what Mark Little is getting at is, the mineral rights owners have a role to play through government participation in these conversations, because at the end of the day, what the government needs and what Suncor needs in this instance is a healthy economy propelling things forward. So the government, all Mark Little is doing there is signaling that what the government already knows and is already aware of how it's participating in those kinds of conversations. And I'll give one great example for service providers again to watch is Alberta Innovates has this phenomenal research program called Bitumen Beyond Combustion. And if you sort of watch what they're doing in that research initiative, it's all about the sort of the carbon materials world, right? And you'll start to see Mark Little and Alex and Derek Evans and these other folks, that they'll start to reference these programs because there's this really kind of neat interrelationship between the way the companies operate and the companies operating with the government partnerships. The Clean Resource Innovation Network, of which Suncor and Cenovus and lots of other companies are involved in, is largely a federally funded initiative out of the federal government's Strategic Innovation Fund. And it's a way that the government has found appropriate to support the way the industry evolves in an energy transition space through further and further adoption of new next generation clean technologies. So government is a big partner in this process. All Mark doing is signaling to the public and stakeholders is that the government will be a partner in that. A long-winded answer to a short question, but a great question.
Thank you. And this person asks if you have a preference between Prime Minister Trudeau's carbon tax and Erin O'Toole's carbon savings account in terms of which two will help us get to net zero earlier.
If I had the answer to that, I'd be putting it in bottles and selling it and retiring in 2 days. It's very hard. It's very hard for any business to sort of unpack or tease out from the politics of carbon which is the most appropriate methodology that will help us reach our goals. I talk to people every day who economists who are in big favor of cap and trade systems, and the next economist is saying, no, absolute reductions are the only way to go, because you just get into the mugs game of fooling yourselves on buying somebody else's efficiency. And that, so I don't really have an answer to the question other than that you have to figure it out for your own business. What are the forces impinging upon the carbon conversation that have a, how shall I say it, that the best you can figure out have the most direct impact on your company in terms of the implications for it. And it's going to be a crazy, messy set of conversations over the next few years on this. And the more you can sort of set yourself up to be insulated from the politics of carbon and be able to tease out what the practicalities of carbon are. Now, if governments change, that's a pivot that you have to make as a company to say, what do they preserve from the old government and what do they rebrand and renew? I'll give you an example. In Alberta, the reigning Conservative government saw some sense in what the NDP government had set up in the Climate Change and Emissions Management Corporation. They just rebranded it Energy Reduction Alberta and left it largely intact. A bit of change to the funding mechanism and that sort of thing, but fundamentally it's the same set of processes by which we penalize emitters and then take the penalty money and put it back into research and innovation. Those are the more practical things to watch in terms of what's really happening in the real emissions reduction space, I sense, rather than what really is part of a party's platform right now, because most economists and most scientists would tell you a lot of that is built on vaporware to begin with. So.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bill. It's a great answer. How far behind are the U.S. companies compared to Canadian in terms of their approach to net zero?
That's a loaded question, and I would say the best way is you have leaders of the pack in both countries, and you have laggards of the pack in both countries. And again, I wouldn't say that Canada is particularly any distance ahead of the U.S. I would say that the leading companies in both Canada and the U.S. are doing very, very well in terms of how shall I say it, in that sustainability net zero foot race. So we've got top of best of breed companies in both places, and but we have laggards of the pack as well. And that's a really good question, because the other thing to reflect on is what are the bigger operator companies going to do in order to, because we can't have a fragmented approach within the sector of some are really performing well and some are really performing poorly. Society expects the whole industry to pull together. So you're going to start to see lots of pressure from the bigger operators on the smaller operators to pick up the pace of their own sustainability thinking and strategy. We already see that happening. And the true leaders in the group are doing it through collaboration and not shaming. And so that's an important thing to watch across your whole customer base is, all of a sudden these companies that are getting with the act on it, simply because the bigger companies are putting the pressure on them to perform in terms of, but in Canada, we like to thump our chest and say we're better at this than anybody else in the world. The reality is some companies are better, and in the US, lots of great companies doing some fascinating things. But the best way to understand that is to look at your customer group, download their sustainability reports, which are available on their websites, and really start to dive into them to find out if they're truly leading in change or they're really just sort of talking about change.
We'll cut it off after this last question. When do you expect Scope 3 emissions disclosure to be made mandatory, and do you see this as a factor in forcing service companies to become net zero?
Another wonderful question. So, in fact, we're actually running courses now on Scope 3 dynamics and what it means to companies. I suspect that you'll start to see that, and you've already seen some of the major international companies say they're going to tackle Scope 3 emissions, and of course that is really really engaging with your stakeholder world in a much different way in terms of asking people who drive cars and who who are using your products and making their own emissions to behave in a different way. But I suspect that within the next 5 years, we'll see the industry, not only through the corporations, but the industry organizations figuring out a way that all members of the industry can participate in the Scope 3 conversation, which will be critical from that absolute reductions process on that pathway. I would just guide folks to look at Shell's own movement in this space in terms of figuring out how and monitor how Shell is moving toward its Scope 3 strategy.
Thank you, Bill. All right, that is all of the questions for today. Thank you to everybody for joining us. Bill, thank you so much for your time, your expertise. We all enjoyed it very much, and have a wonderful summer.
All right, thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.